People love to talk about generations, so we'll start there. You've probably heard some terms in this area before, such as baby boomer. So, if you don't mind, let's see by a show of hands, how many baby boomers do we have in the room? All right, cool. So keep your hands in the air for a minute because I want the rest of the room to see that not all of you look like these people. Very important. Very important. All right. Thank you. So boomers were the hippies of the 60s, then the yuppies of the 80s, and are still many of our leaders across different fields. Okay, then we have Generation X. That happens to be my generation. How many of my fellow Gen Xers are out there? Oh, I get a woo. I don't usually get a woohoo for Gen X, so that's pretty cool. We're usually kind of flying below the radar, which is how we like it. So generational bonus points. If you can name the movie. Anybody recognize Rally Bites? That was quick. Yep. That's right. Came out in 1994, right around the time we got our reputation for being slackers, if you remember that. All right. Then we have millennials. How many millennials do we have joining us? That's where I always get the woohoo, is for millennials. So it took me some time to find a good picture for this group. I like this one because it has some of the technology. They also kind of look like they're in Brooklyn, like they just ate some artisanal cheese. Or maybe some avocado toast. I don't know. That is an internet rumor. I don't know if I believe that one myself. All right. And then we have Gen Z. How many Gen Zers do we have in the room? A few. Okay, I got a woohoo too. That's awesome. I've got only a few. Yeah. So Gen Z is the first generation to spend their entire adolescence in the age of the smartphone. So, of course, we have a group of kids coming up who are younger than Gen Z. What are we going to call them? Because we ran out of letters. Uh-oh. So some people say, okay, we'll go back to the beginning of the alphabet and use the Greek letters and call them alphas. I'm not a huge fan of the letters, so I call this group polars, like melting polar ice caps and political polarization. Everybody groans just like that. So probably not going to catch on. The letters are kind of derivative and not original. So what's interesting, too, is that the intergenerational sniping has already started. Gen Z has a name for this group. They call them crusty iPad kids. And it is true, they are the first generation to never know a world without the iPad. And apparently they don't wash their hands before they use it. And that is how it becomes crusty. So I hear. So how can we figure out how generations really differ from each other? I think the best way is to go straight to the source, to ask people, particularly young people, how they spend their time, how they're feeling, what's important to them. And fortunately, several large and nationally representative surveys have done that. Even better, some of them go back decades. And that's really powerful because it means we can zero in on what's actually different as opposed to just being a certain age. These are also very large, but 43 million people have filled out one or another of these surveys that I included in the paperback edition of Generations. So we can really learn a lot from this. So, generations happen because cultures change. Growing up now is so completely different from what it was like to grow up in the 1950s or the 1980s or even the 2000s, that it's like growing up in another culture or another country. So I've structured the presentation around the things that have had the biggest impact, particularly on kids, teens, and young adults, with step one being this: the childhood and adolescence began to change. So a couple of examples. So I always like starting with this one, which is playgrounds. Because what do playgrounds look like now? Usually like this. You know, the slides are plastic. That green stuff, that's not grass. That's that bouncy stuff. So if you fall, it doesn't hurt as much. All right, boomers and Gen X, what did playgrounds look like when we were young? They were metal and had rocks. Even the fancy ones were metal and had rocks. And that slide was 300 degrees on a summer day because it was metal. You had to watch out for that. And of course, it wasn't just playgrounds. It was roaming the neighborhood with your friends on your bike. If you're younger, like these boys here, maybe it was a block or two. The older kid, probably most of the neighborhood. And your parents sometimes didn't know where you were. It was be home at dinner. It was come home when the street lights come on. That was the standard. In a more urban area, I love this picture. You know, these kids look like they're maybe between 8 and 12. So that big thing of cardboard, it's so they can break dance. And again, this is, come on when the streetlights came on. I'm sure their parents had no clue where they were. And there they were coming up with their own things to do, probably in New York on a summer day. So this is part of a bigger cultural story. We see all these examples of kids don't walk to school as much anymore. And there's actual data on this. Even kids who live within a mile of school, now very few of them will walk or bike to school by themselves. Back in the 60s, 70s, even 80s, early 90s, it was much more common for kids to make their own way to school. So here's the bigger story. At times and places, when people live longer, when healthcare is better, and when education takes longer to finish, parents tend to make the choice to have fewer children and nurture them more carefully. And those children grow to independence more slowly. So that's the slow life strategy. And I'm going to talk about it with kids and teens, but it goes throughout the whole lifespan. It means taking longer to grow up and longer to grow old because we have more time to do that. So the slow life strategy is a pretty good description for how we raise kids now. And that's in contrast to, say, the mid-20th century, because back then, instead, what did people do? They had a lot of kids, and they would just hope it worked out. That was how it was done. So my mother's family was like that, 8 kids on a dairy farm in Minnesota. And my mom's brothers, my uncles, tell me these crazy stories like, oh, we went skinny dipping in the river and the neighborhood girls stole our clothes. They tell this story every single family reunion. So finally had to ask them, how old were you when that happened? And one of my uncles said, I don't know, I think I was 8 or 9. Wait, what? Where are your parents? And that's my grandparents. Then I'm realizing, well, it is 1950, and that is how you raise kids back then. It was the free-range kids and be home at dinner. And that's just how it was. They grew to independence at an earlier age. That is the fast life strategy in a nutshell. Now, neither one of these strategies is all bad or all good. They're adaptations to particular place and time. So keep that in mind. We look at some of the trends that we don't want to necessarily go to bad versus good. Instead, we're going to focus on what does this mean for how quickly or slowly kids and teens are growing up. So some parents will push back and say, oh, kids are growing up faster because they have access to so much information online. That does have some truth to it, but it leaves out the real world. And I think it also has some nostalgia to it. It has the idea that, oh, but when I was growing up, it was a much more innocent time. Was it really? I don't know. I think we have some photographic evidence suggesting maybe it wasn't quite so innocent. I could show you my own 1980s high school photo album, but I won't. I will spare you the big hair.